Okay, we'll just make a start at this time. Thank you for everyone who joins, whether it's in person or I think more likely through recordings to these live online sessions. I appreciate you being part of them. I want to make sure that I offer these chances for interaction, whether it is through discussion forums or through these weekly times spent together. So this week, it's time to look a little bit backwards and a little bit forward. So we just last week took our first exam and our first practical test. And from what I've looked at the grades and I've looked at the work that has came in, you are really doing fantastic job in this class, and I'm very, very appreciative of that and very impressed by the effort that you're putting in. So please know that it is being noticed and it is definitely highly, highly appreciated by me. Um, as always, however, if you have anything that came up in the exam or practical and you want to talk about that, I definitely encourage you to do so. I also today want to look a little bit of the work ahead this week. We have a very typical week, so typical assignments, nothing new there. And really, I was planning to spend most of the time today on this session to review the key points of the lecture material. Of course, as before, there's a lot to cover. So what I'm highlighting is really the most important items, but I would love for you to still study a little bit beyond what we're covering on this session. You have pretty good learning materials on your Canvas course, and your textbook is a great resource as well. As I said before, if you have thoughts, what's working well, what we should keep doing, or if there's something where we can try a different approach, please do not hesitate to let me know, whether it's through discussion forums, whether it's through messaging to me, or by other means. I want to make sure that this course is serving the purposes that you want it to serve for you. Obviously, we have certain requirements, what I need to do, but I also am very open to making each semester to look like the way that that particular group wants it to look like. So all I'm saying is that let's keep the communication going and let me know what I can do and how I can help you. I'm gonna jump to the homework for this week. So this week we have two assignments for you to do, Chapter 8 quiz and then Chapter 8 practice anatomy. And both of those are due at the end of the week. I think it's gonna be the Sunday, it's gonna be October 6th, if I'm not totally wrong. And they followed very much the same format that we've seen before. So you'll be completing both the quiz and practice anatomy on our publisher's web platform on Connect. And those grades will then transfer to our gradebook on Canvas. That's something that I'm asking you to make sure that you get those in. As always, if you miss an occasional assignment, I'm happy to work with you, reopen those. But really doing those assignments is probably the best possible preparation for exams and practicals. So what you saw in the last exam and last practical is very much the format that I follow in general. This is all work building up towards testing as well. So let's have a look of a little bit of the human skeleton first and then move on to individual bones. So the word skeleton, skeletos, comes from Greek language, referring to dried up or mummy, dried up body. What we're seeing there is really that the bones have often been structures that we've studied even in history and considered that they are very much what it is. That's the object that you have in front of you. Other human tissues, animal tissues typically tend to decay and not remain available for us to study and observe as much as the bones do. I do want to, though, at this point to clarify that that might be a little bit of misleading in terms of students sometimes end up then thinking that bones are very much of a stable, solid structure in the body, and that's not the case. There's constantly a lot of changes happening in your skeleton. We're building new bone, breaking down old bone, and through that process, responding really to the needs of the body. So I think a good example of that is that we need a certain amount of stress on our bones. And with the stress, I'm not talking about psychological stress. I'm talking about stress as it comes to mechanical stress towards those bones. And as bones are exposed to mechanical stress, that will have an impact on how that bone then reorganizes to be able to resist and handle that stress, and that strengthens the bones. So bones that are never used are not going to be probably the strongest bones. If bones are used, that also strengthens the bones. So having said all that, I wanted to take a little bit of a step backwards from our course content and go back to what you've learned in your introductory biology courses. I think BIO201 would probably address this. I want to remind you that there's many different kinds of skeletons that we see in the animals around us and world of animals. So endoskeleton is bones that are internal bones. I have there a really nice picture at the very top doing a little bit of comparative anatomy between the horses and humans, especially of the lower limb. And yes, that's common for many animals, that many animals do have an internal skeleton. But that's not the only type of skeleton that we really see. Exoskeleton is a skeleton that's located outside the animal's body. So there I have an example. We have many insects that rely on that. So exoskeleton is the skeleton that's not embedded in the body. It's actually outside the body, holding the body in its shape and in its place through that process. Hydroskeleton is something that we sometimes see in some animals, such as worms, earthworm, that I have an example of there. So it is the water within those tissues that gives those tissues and gives that organism its shape and rigidity in that sense. And obviously we see also skeletons on a microscopic level on cells as the cytoskeletons of the cells. Those are those small filament and tubules that run through the cell, kind of providing the scaffolding, but also transportation pathways within those cells. So many types of skeletons. Our interest on this course is obviously going to be the human endoskeleton, and that's what we're going to be spending most of our time on. We're going to start by looking at the axial skeleton. Axial skeleton is composed of 80 different bones, and we will focus only on the most important ones. But when we're thinking of the axial skeleton, that's obviously going to be our skull, our vertebral column, and our thoracic cage. Appendicular skeleton is then going to be your upper limbs and lower limbs. And I always encourage my students to pay attention to those transition points. So we transition from the axial skeleton to appendicular skeleton when it comes to our clavicle, so our collarbone, and our scapula, so our shoulder blade. Those are part of the appendicular skeleton of the upper limb. Same goes for the hips. Hips are going to be part of the appendicular skeleton of the lower limbs. So make sure that you know those transitional areas that might be useful for you. When we're talking about the axial skeleton, there's a couple of points that I wanted to highlight. I think my students often find this useful and interesting exercise to do. So if we think of the function of the axial skeleton, it really provides us this longitudinal axis of the body. So it gives this longest axis that we see in the body for us. In addition to that, the axial skeleton really provides support areas for us. So supporting our head, neck, and trunk. So a lot of other structures then are attached to the axial skeleton, but axial skeleton provides that framework. And finally, I think I skipped a little bit too far, so let's come back. Finally, we're also seeing that axial skeleton forms these spaces that protect important vital organs, such as your brain, your spinal cord, and the organs within your thoracic cavity. All of those are enclosed one way or another within bony structures to provide them provide them protection, even mechanically. So I think that that's a good way of looking at the axial skeleton, a few different functions to notice there. And we're going to start by looking at the skull. And skull can be in general divided into two portions. So we're going to have our cranial bones that really form the structures that enclose the brain within the cranial cavity, and obviously provide a lot of attachment points for the muscles of the head and neck. And then the facial bones, which are going to form the framework of the face, and especially contours of the special organs such as sight, taste, smell, passageways for air and food, and often also provide as attachment points for muscles of facial expression. So that's going to be something important when we think of the communication that we do. So these 22 bones that we have, and this is the most complex set of bony structures in the body, so don't be scared away. But these 22 bones that we have forming the skull can be divided into 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones. We're going to go through these regions quickly, but again, you do remember that you have full material available from your lecture materials. So let's look at the cranial bones. Like I said, cranials form the cranial cavity, cranium, and enclose the brain inside. We will see that a lot of these bones are single bones, but we also have some paired bones. So the frontal bone is going to form the front part of the skull skeleton, cranial skeleton, and then we're going to have on each side, left and right side, one parietal bone, so one on both sides, so 2 in total. We're also going to see our temporal bone that forms the kind of lateral portion, side portion of the skull, very prominent there. We'll see some special characteristics there, like an opening for the auditory structures, and we see the first part heading towards the zygomatic bone, so which is going to give rise to a bone that gives us our cheekbones. We're also going to see a sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone is largely hidden inside the skull, so we see a little bit of it on each side laterally, but a lot of it is inside that cranial vault. We will also see our ethmoid bone. Ethmoid bone forms a little portion of the eye socket. You can just slightly see it from the outside. And then we have most posteriorly obviously our occipital bone, which is an important bone at the back, again providing protection for the brain, but also important attachment points for the muscles. If I'm thinking about these, sometimes students feel a little overwhelmed with the amount of information that we teach them. I always encourage spend the time now to learn these bones, because we will use this language very much in subsequent things that we'll do when we talk, for example, about muscles. A lot of the time these bone names come in handy, or even in the case of the lobes of the brain, we will see that these cranial bones are used to name those. So even though it might feel like a lot now, I really, really do encourage you to spend that time now, and then it makes your subsequent study much easier. I think we have covered at least most of the cranial bones that I wanted to mention. I did want to do this distinction for the cranium, how we can divide that into cranial vault, which is the portion that really holds the brain and surrounds the brain. And then we have the cranial base, which is really the inferior portion forming the floor of these structures. I do also want to remind you that cranium has many different openings for things like spinal cord, brainstem, for ears, nasal structures, orbits. So a lot of structures, a lot of holes, a lot of things to learn from there. And I think that that's particularly well illustrated on this picture. In your subsequent studies, you will learn each one of these openings, what goes through those openings. We're not going to spend time today on that. We'll see, for example, the really prominent foramen magnum, which is the big hole, literally translated from Latin, through which the brainstem and then spinal cord passes through. But all of those openings are definitely worth of studying and becoming familiar with. I also wanted to talk really briefly a little bit about the bones that form our junction points for the bones of the skull. And we're seeing that these are going to be sutures. So let's have a look at those. Coronal suture separates your parietal and frontal bones. So think of again that direction where the hands would be if you put a crown on. So again, we're seeing that learning those body planes comes in handy now that we're identifying those sutures. We're also seeing our sagittal suture, which separates really the right and left parietal bones of your skull. We're also seeing a lambdoid suture, which really separates the occipital bone from the parietal bone at the back of the head. And then we have our squamous suture separating the temporal bone from the parietal bone. So make sure that you are comfortable and familiar with those structures as well. They're useful to have. Let's have a look of a little bit of the facial bones and bones of the face. There's going to be 14 in total. I just want to highlight few of them as the most important, but you'll see that there's a lot going on. We will see that we have small bones like inferior nasal conchae, which really is inside the nasal cavity forming those structures. Our lacrimal bone really contributing to that eye socket. But one of the ones that we're going to spend a little bit more time in just a bit is going to be our mandible, so our jawbone. That is the U-shaped bone. You'll see it contributes to the formation of the chin. And we have a few more characteristics of mandible that we want to learn about. I also wanted to mention our maxilla. So that's just above the jaw, forming the majority of the face. Notice that there's two, one on each side, left and right. So a lot to see there. We also see our zygomatic bones. One on the sides, one on each side, forming the cheek. So again, we see certain differences between different group of people. Some have higher cheekbones, some don't have. And it is really that the bony structure will contribute to the rest of the appearance of your face significantly. I finally wanted to mention also the bridge of the nose, the nasal bone. Notice that most of the nose is cartilage, but there is the bone of the bridge of the nose as well. This is something that we consider when we do things like nose jobs and stuff, that we make sure that we do whether we have to deal with the bone or the cartilage. Sometimes this bone might be broken intentionally to really do differences. Sometimes it's also that in fights, accidents, this bone gets broken and doesn't fuse nicely, so we might come back to that. But like I said, we've got a lot of other smaller bones. Some of these I've already mentioned: lacrimal, palatine, vomer, and the inferior nasal conchae, that are definitely worth looking at. But I really wanted on this review focus on the big picture idea. Moving onwards, I wanted to talk a little bit about the mandible, so our jawbone. Let's have a look of, I don't have labels, but I might be able to use a pointer to highlight few structures from there. So the majority of the mandible that we see here is going to be the body of the mandible. You'll notice in many anatomical structures, the largest part is called body. We also see the angle of mandible, so the what gives really whether you have very chiseled or not a jawline. It's not just the bone, it's actually the muscles that attach here as well that contributes that. And we call the part coming up ramus of the mandible. We'll also see that we have this notch between two end parts on the posteriorly on the mandible. So we have our condylar condylar notch or condylar process and coronoid process more anteriorly. It is the condylar one that contributes to the temporomandibular joint, so the joint between the mandible and the temporal bone. That's an important one there to see. I think on this one, I can also point out the alveolar processes, which is really where the roots of the teeth embed into the bone. This is particularly important because if a patient loses all of the teeth, then the stress to this bone area will stop existing and this bone will actually deteriorate. So even if the patient doesn't have dentition, we want them to wear dentures and so on, so that this bone is put under stress and remains there and doesn't disappear away. What else can we see? We can see one of my favorite bones, probably. That's going to be our hyoid bone. In terms of our hyoid bone, what makes it a little bit more different than other bones, it's that it's one of the very, very few bones that don't articulate with other bones. So it's the ligaments, soft tissues, muscles that hold it on its place. We can see that again, we have body, the largest part, and then we have lesser and greater horn. That contribute also to the hyoid bone. There is a forensic relevance that often hyoid bone does fracture when someone gets strangled, not always, however, but that is something that we might check sometimes as well. I also wanted to talk about sinuses and just briefly here, because I think we'll return back to those in our AMP2, but we have empty spaces inside the bones of the skull. So within the frontal bone, we have our frontal sinuses above the eye sockets. Within the maxillary bones, we have our maxillary sinuses. There, we also have our ethmoid sinuses, or I call them ethmoid labyrinth, a series of small spaces inside the ethmoid bone. And then all the way back, kind of in the middle of the skull, so you kind of have to imagine that this is looking inside, not on the surface, our sphenoid sinus as well. The purpose of these sinuses, there's some amount of debate what they are and what they do, but what we generally end up seeing is that they help with reducing the weight of the skull. They also help with providing us a space for the voice resonance that gives you your unique voice. They also some have speculated would provide kind of a way to handle direct impacts. So like at the front of the car is designed to collapse, maybe the sinuses collapse as well, so we don't get as strong of an impact if we hit face first to an obstacle. And then we know that there's a role with the immune system. We just don't fully understand what the role of paranasal sinuses is yet. But that's something that's definitely something that we explore. So now that we've had a look of sinuses, and we will round back to those sinuses and talk more about those on our AMP2 class. I'm very passionate about those at that time, and we'll see a little more detail. I do want to talk a little bit about our vertebral column. And a vertebral column runs all the way from the skull all the way to the pelvis. We see many different names: spine, spinal column. If we think of why do we have a vertebral column, it really comes to functions. And there's a few different functions. A vertebral column helps us to transmit weight, but also it protects the spinal cord that's running inside. And it provides us many attachment points for other bony structures and also for muscular structures. If we do a little bit of revision from what we learned last time, whereas bones of the skull are flat bones, the vertebral column would be made of irregular bones. So let's have a look of different kinds of bones that make up our vertebral column. So we've divided these into sections. So we're going to have cervical vertebra, which consists of 7 bones, thoracic vertebra that consists of 12, and lumbar vertebra that consists of 5 portions. Sometimes my students say that it helps them to think of it, the numbers, that at what times you would be eating breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and dinner at 5. If that helps you, that might be one way to look at the numbers of the bones. In addition, we have sacrum and coccyx. Sacrum initially starts as 5 different bones that then fuse together, and coccyx from 4 and fuses together. So maybe that's helpful. I hope so. Other thing that I want to highlight is that the curvature of the vertebral column is really important. When the child is born, they just have like a C-shaped curvature on the vertebral column. So that's what the whole process, lifting the head, learning to crawl, then standing up, is that we need to create these curvatures as well so we can transmit the weight properly and the walking can happen. We will also see that a lot of vertebrae are strengthened by the ligaments to each other. What we're seeing here is intervertebral discs. So these cushion-like pads that enable us to have more mobility, but also serve the purpose of shock absorption. So it's not bone against bone. Sometimes we might have a situation where we have herniated discs, so a disc bulging out. This could be due to a physical trauma. It could be because other reasons that might cause stress on spinal cord or nerves. So that's often a thing that we need to tackle. And there's many treatments, whether it's exercising, massaging, heat, painkillers, or in some cases, even surgery. That is an option that we might consider. We could talk a lot more about the vertebral column. I normally talk with my students about scoliosis, so abnormal curvature of the vertebral column. But for the interest of time, I think this is a good place for us. I do want to, however, highlight from an average typical vertebra, few different parts. Again, we're seeing the body is the largest part, the bony part that really takes the weight. We're also going to see a foramen, which is an opening there. This is where the spinal cord will run. We'll see transverse processes. These are where ribs attach to. And then we see also spinous process posteriorly. So a lot of good structures to know. What this picture obviously is us looking down of a typical vertebra, but you could look it from different directions. You'll notice also that the vertebra just slightly changes as we go through those and as we learn different amount of weight that's being exposed to those and so on and so on. Let's have a look of next thoracic gauge. So thorax or thoracic cage, what it does, it really attaches to the vertebra, forming this thoracic region, and there's multiple functions. What thoracic cage does, it protects our vital organs like heart, lungs, supports the upper limbs, which we'll be talking about, and serves as their attachment point. Also, many attachment points for important muscles of the neck, back, chest, and shoulders. So many reasons to talk about the thoracic cage. Let's highlight a little bit of the bony structure. So we're going to start with the chest bone or breastbone, and that is going to be our sternum. Sternum can be divided into three portions. We have our body, which is the main part in the middle. We have our manubrium, the superior part, and then we have our xiphoid process, the most inferiorly. This is usually not ossified only until you get to about 40 years of age. There can be all kinds of interesting clinical cases, for example, xiphoid process not being aligned the direction that it should be, but causing us issues because of that. For the interest of time, let's have a look of the ribs. We're going to have 12 pairs of ribs. 7 of those are going to be true ribs because they attach directly to the sternum, as we can see here, for example. We also have 3 false ribs. What we're talking about, those, they do not attach directly. We actually can see that they attach through the costal cartilage bundle. And then we have 2 floating ribs as well. That are not directly attached. We could study each rib individually and see that they have a head, they have a shaft, they have a neck, and they have a tubercle. So those are things that you can review in more detail if you're interested. So that's our axial skeleton as a quick review. Let's have a look of appendicular skeleton. Like I mentioned, it's the upper limbs, lower limbs, and it's these attachment points that we're particularly interested, whether it's a pectoral girdle for the upper limb or pelvic girdle for the lower limb. So we tend to spend time whether we're talking about the shoulder or the hips to pay attention to those. So let's have a look of some of the bones that contribute to the pectoral girdle. So we're going to see that our scapula, so our shoulder blade, also our clavicle, so collarbone, and then humerus play a role in that. What pectoral girdle does, it really provides us a site for the muscles to attach, and also attaches the upper limb to the axial skeleton. We'll see that this bony fit between the glenoid cavity of the scapula and head of the humerus is very, very poor. That allows us to have a large range of movement, but it really establishes a poor bony stability. So it's not uncommon for us to see shoulder dislocations and things like that. Really, shoulder is held in place thanks to the powerful muscles and all other soft tissue, connective tissue holding it together, but it's definitely not the bony fit that helps there. And let's have a look next, scapula, a little bit more in detail, what we can highlight from there. And again, it's not going to be enough for us to just know that this is a scapula. We have to do a little bit more. So here we're seeing anterior and posterior view. So our shoulder blade is very thin, triangular, flat bone that attaches the rib cage to the rib cage on the dorsal side. So between ribs 2 and 7. And there's really three borders. We have our superior border, which is really short and sharp, medial border, which runs along the plane of the spine, and then lateral border that really gives us this angle. So that gives us three angles. We get our superior angle, an inferior angle, and our lateral angle as well. The part that I mentioned, the glenoid cavity, is where the head of humerus articulates with the scapula. So you'll notice that it's not particularly large, this fossa, this region here. We could also highlight on the posterior side the spine of the scapula. That's the ridge on the posterior side that separates the superior and inferior portions. If we look at the acromion, that's the more lateral of these projections, articulates with the clavicle, forming a acromioclavicular joint. And then we have our coracoid process projection on the anterior side here. For example, biceps muscle attaches to this. What else can we see? We can see a suprascapular notch at the superior border of the scapula. This is where many nerves pass through. We can also talk about fossa, regions of the bone, regions that we see, and these are going to be particularly important when we talk about muscles. So we have supraspinous fossa above the spine and infraspinous fossa below the spine. We also have subscapular fossa, kind of on the edge that connects the scapula to the rib cage. So I think that that's going to serve for our review of these structures. Let's have a look of upper limb. There's going to be 30 bones involved. Wrists and hand really form most of those, I believe 27. And let's have a look of the most important bones. And as I've said before, just knowing the bone alone is not enough. We need to also know special characteristics of that bone and parts of the bone. So what we're seeing here is humerus. Humerus is the largest and biggest bone of the upper limb, forming the arm. A couple of parts to know of the humerus. We have a head part, that's the proximal end, that articulates with the glenoid cavity of the scapula. And within there, we'll see a greater tubercle, which is the bigger, and lesser tubercle, which is the smaller. These bumps at the lateral distal end are really important for us when we're talking about rotator cuff muscles attaching there. We can also talk about an anatomical neck that separates the head from the rest of the humerus, and surgical neck, which is where it fractures. So there's a little bit of debate on where the neck of the humerus is, depending on who you ask it from. And what else can we see? We see a little bump halfway through. This is our deltoid tuberosity, about halfway down the shaft, an important attachment point for the deltoid muscle, which wraps around the shoulder. We could also see a radial groove there. And at the distal end, we see trochlea at the middle of the distal, and epicondyle, most medial and most lateral, and then capitulum, the anterior lateral side. Really, what I want to highlight that when there's a bump on the bone, that's typically an attachment point for the muscle. So that pull on that causes that bone then to form a little bumpy structure where the muscle can attach to. Let's have a look of the bones of the forearm. So these really contribute to the formation of the elbow with what we saw earlier on. Notice that elbow is very complex joint. We'll study that in detail later on, but there's actually multiple joints, three bones that come together forming multiple joints. Let's start by looking at the ulna. From the ulna, few parts to know, we see olecranon process here. That's the cup-like portion that grabs the trochlea of the humerus on the posterior side. We have our coronoid process as well that articulates with the trochlea of the humerus. And then we have our radial notch where the ulna and radius articulate, and same goes at the distal end. Let's talk a little bit about radius. This is the lateral one of the two. So if you're standing in an anatomical position, radius runs on the thumb side, ulna on the pinky side. Parts to know, I guess, for the radius, we would see also the head here that articulates both with humerus and ulna. And we see the radial tuberosity as well, important attachment point for the biceps muscle, for example. Let's have a look quickly of the wrist bones, carpal bones. There's going to be 8 of those. So scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. I don't make you learn those, but it might be fun if you're into that kind of stuff to know those. We also will see metacarpals that form our palm. So there's 5 bones there, numbered from the thumb to the little finger in order 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we have phalanges that form the fingers. There's going to be 14. Notice how there's 3 in fingers 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 2 on thumb. Pollex is what we refer thumb as, and the rest of the fingers 2 to 5, as digits. Well, moving forward, let's have a look of the lower limb, and let's start with the hips. Hips are actually made of 3 hip bones and sacrum. We learned that with the vertebral column, and let's have a look of those bones. So we have our ilium, ischium, and pubis. Ilium is the most superior one. Ischium is really the posterior inferior. That's the sitting bone that you sit on. And pubis then anteriorly. A student told me where your pubes would be at. I think that we could highlight a few different parts here on the pelvis as well. Acetabulum is the socket where the lower limb head of femur joins to. What else could we see? We could see the body of the ilium, the largest part. We could see the iliac crest, the superior margin. Obviously, the opening of the hip, I'm going to go back, plays crucial role for the delivery of the child. So that's going to be a slightly different shape depending on whether we have a male or female. Actually, this cartilage will open as well, facilitating the child delivery. Pubic symphysis, important part, like I mentioned, joining the 2 hips. And then we can look at the pubic angle as well, telling us sex difference often between males and females. So sometimes when you get bones, you can definitely tell whether it's a girl or a boy based on the skeleton. I think we're gonna just move ahead in the interest of time and have a look of our lower limb bones or that make up the lower limb, and we're gonna start with the femur. This is the only bone of the thigh, largest and strongest bone of the body. Few parts to know. We have the head part that articulated with the acetabulum of the hip. We have a neck that often gets fractured. And then we have our greater trochanter and lesser trochanter major muscle attachment sites of the femur. We will also see laterally and medial condyle, epicondyle at the distal, and between them we have a fossa. This is the site for the patella to articulate with as well. Let's keep going on and have a look of the leg portion. Here we're seeing tibia and fibula. Tibia is the medial one that carries all of the weight from femur to the feet. And again, the language follows what you have learned before. We have medial and lateral condyles, and we are seeing the tibia and fibula articulating against each other as well. In terms of the fibula, the lateral one of these bones does not carry any weight, very similar terms, head and lateral bumps and so on. When it comes to the bones of the foot, we're going to see our tarsal bones forming the ankle, 7 of those, metatarsals, 5, and then phalanges, 14 bones forming the toes. Notice hallux is going to be our great bone, the big bone. So I know that was kind of a quick overview of some of the most important bones in the skeleton. Like I've said multiple times in the past, really the easiest way and best way to learn anatomy is memorization. So there's some amount of that needed. I encourage you as you're reviewing the bones to kind of study them one by one, but also look at how they fit together in a bigger picture. I think that at this point, we've done a fairly good review of the material, and in the interest of time, I'm going to save the review of the homework and having a look of that for our second weekly meeting in case someone shows up to that. So if you're interested, we will peek in there. I won't repeat this going through all of the bones again. And as always, I do want you to know that I am here to help. You can contact me anytime. That's a big part of my job and what I enjoy interacting with the students. So please, please, please feel free to use me as a resource. I'm also trying probably something a little different in this week on the discussion forums to kind of get more of a dialogue going on there. So let's see how that takes off. But you can always post whatever you feel that you want to share. But I'll try a few different kinds of prompts that deviate from the past. I think that that brings us to a good point to finish this session today. I really appreciate you being part of this class, and I hope that it was useful to review these bones together. Until next class, thank you and bye.